everything that's alive. So yeah, and the paying attention, the being, it doesn't mean being hyper aware all the time. It just means learning to like chill and go with the flow, and be diverted down this road, down that road, into that bush, go down that pathway. Oh, okay, no, maybe I'll go down that pathway. Why am I going down there? I don't know. Oh shit, there's a bird being damaged. I don't know if it's beyond help. Usually if a bird is showing sickness or injury, it's probably too late to do anything. But find the bird, take the bird home. The bird dies with you, then the bird was meant to die with you. There was a relationship building there, and you were nurturing its death. It's learning to have these very short and fluid relationships with everything, because then it all starts talking back to you. And I think that's one of the things that hooks into what Al's doing. Is Al's, and I know very little about what Al does. And when people say geomancy to me, I'm like, I have no idea. I could go away and read on it, but I haven't done it, so therefore I have no idea. But by building a relationship with your environment and paying attention all the time, just being normal, you start to get communication back, which can be a form of divination. And so it starts to augury. It starts to open up interesting doors. And what Al does, and the people through the centuries that developed what Al does, noticed this and started formulating the language, because the land does have its own language, regardless of what country you're in. There are certain things that are inherent. So you can talk to someone from, India, in the middle of India, and they'll say, oh, yeah, we've got beings that do that. Yeah, no. When we see birds, we think the same thing. That's interesting. And you start to realise that although we can't all speak each other's languages, the land can. And the land will keep, saying, hello, hi, hello, hi. And eventually you figure out that the land is trying to make a connection. That consciousness could be from a tree, a rock, a bird, a spring, a river, and everything communicates with you. As soon as you get rid of the 20th and 21st century, I am totally sane, so therefore there is nothing talking to me. I am too scientific for that, or I'm too organised, too intelligent to think about that. You throw all that out the window and just go with it and start paying attention. And then if you don't get, taken away and locked in a psychiatric unit, then you're probably doing okay, and you can start to build on that.
I love how you articulated that distinction between, I suppose, like an active attention and then a passive attentiveness. In an earlier conversation with Isabel Stengers, she talks about this idea of being able to be surprised by what lurks, I think is her expression. It's just this, it's like an awareness, but it's not an awareness that you're actively feeding. I think it also speaks to this stereotype of magic that a lot of people have, which is that it's the ability to manipulate the world at will, which was the one that was carried on to sort of early modern science, right? Whereas there's this other side to magic, which is actually the ability to listen and to become, a conversation partner.
Yes, it's the same thing is when you start interacting as a magician and you're interacting with them, you're building patterns of behaviour. You're building energetic patterns. You're building patterns of communication, and everything around you has their own patterns. And the awareness is when you are aware of these patterns. People call it faith. People call it all different sorts of things. It doesn't matter. But that when it starts to shift, you feel it. That's your passive awareness. It bumps up against you, and it's not quite what you think it should be. That feels a bit weird. What's going on there? And so you follow that feeling. You follow that shift in the pattern, which can be to do with the changing weather that's coming in. It can be to do with it. When I lived on the San Andreas Fault, then I got a crash course in how patterns communicate with you and how you feel it, because it's right there, and there is no way of explaining it. But you feel the earthquake just before it happens, and it isn't that you're feeling it before it happens, is that you're picking up on the vibration before it gets strong enough to start shaking things. So again, it's a passive awareness, and that builds your communication with the land. The land is talking by starting to move, and you pick up on that at a very subtle level. So you've got your warning, get out the house, or sit there and let the house fall down, but have an interesting experience while you're going through that. But yeah, it's very easy, especially in the more shamanic type of magic, to try and rationalize it and to try and give it names, because that's what we do. We give things names and we rationalize. And then you lose 50% of it. If you learn not to rationalize and not to classify and just learn to flow with things, then you start to build communications and build relationships, and relationships then build nurturing, and so on.
Speaking of awareness, I'm aware that Alan's been waiting.
Sorry.
Mm-hmm. No, it's cool. This is wonderful. I love that point you make, Simone, about elements of pattern and patterns can be constellated. And I'm interested in who and what and how that constellating happens, right? We're talking about cultivating awareness and cultivating relationships with patterns and spirits that are there. And I absolutely agree, Josephine, the idea of just trying to impose our own ideas and our own categorizations and our rationalizations definitely gets in the way, it seems, of clear spirit contact, communication, and knowing where you stand in your own presence and your own groundedness at the crossroads of yourself. Certainly. What I'm interested in is where, as a diviner, I'm interested in the natural patterns that are there, that I'm engaging with, that I'm not creating, right? That I am fostering, that are hopefully with my engagement and my, attention and, me showing up and doing what I've said I'll do, that the relationship is emergent. The pattern of collaboration or antagonism in some cases is emergent, but the patterns are already there. And so for me as a diviner, and particularly as a geomancer who is interested in the, what Sam Block calls the theoretical alchemy of how each of these 16 answer figures isn't just a flavor of element, it contains within it a map of how elements are interrelating. And so I'm interested in what the natural flavors of the cosmos are already doing, interacting, and where divination can help us go with that flow more, rather than present us with more mediation that separates us from those experiences and those engagements. So again, I quite agree, Josephine, like this idea of attempting to prove spirits to someone else who's already skeptical about it anyway seems a bit of a fool's errand, if not also trying to nail fog to a wall. That said, I think confirming with divination, and even confirming with computational divination, as well as things that get called non-rational ways of knowing, trance states, altered states, ways of engaging. The best diviners, the best priests, the best magicians I know are people that do both, right? That will throw sticks or shells or some other system, usually like a short throw system, that will confirm, did I just hear the spirit right? And that's not just about, am I really hearing this or not? That's also about ensuring that, grimoires are full of spirits, not just turning up, or not just being commanded or asked or cajoled to turn up to give you information, but also to give you understanding of that information. There are all sorts of lovely, little rules, lawyer loopholes cooked into a lot of those things about, don't just, make sure that you teach me this in a language I can understand. Don't just turn up with a text out of the haunted mirror that I have no idea what it is, right? And so I think about that, not just the imposition of some, top-down model of I think it's the way this is because some old book says so. right? There's the, and that's something I liked about your talk, Josephine, about the kind of DIY empiricism of like, well, what did that spirit feel like? How does it function, right? And I would say that that's cooked into an early modern sense of planetary correspondence, for instance. I think it's very easy to treat correspondence as these like tablets delivered from on high, and like a lot of 19th century orders kind of said that was what it was. So it's not unexpected that people would think about it like that. But these categories aren't there as a scholasticist imposition. They are ways of classifying effect through a lens of a thing that looks like empiricism, right? And Frank Clarson has done great work on showing how early modern conjuration feeds into those like notions of the emergent scientific revolution. But a scorpion doesn't sting because it's martial. It's martial because it stings. Right? These are ways of classifying the things that things are close to, the things that will respond to other things. As Uncle Heinrich Agrippa says, magic is amongst other things, is the agreement and disagreement of nature with itself. So if you know how to vaguely speak a language or sing a song that the scorpion might like or might respond to in a way that is efficacious towards your goal, right? That might include antagonizing or agitating in various ways. So I'm interested in where those categories aren't distancing us, aren't separating us, aren't a matter of individual egos being like, well, I talk to God and he looked like this, but are about what's already there and not having to reinvent wheels. And I'm especially interested in that in terms of the elements and the planets and their engagement in the sublunary realms.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I love that about your talk, where you end by saying that magic, as a pragmatics, can't be an escape, and what you're showing is that it sort of its own logic impedes it from being that, really, if it's taken
on a good day, hopefully. Yeah.
But that's really interesting, because I think the problem isn't so much the techniques and the pragmatics; it's how they're interpreted without being actually engaged in practice, right? I mean, this is the problem with. And the reason why we wanted to have these conversations the way we did was because when we're talking about magic, then you do really lose some of the empiricism, the knowledge that comes with the know-how of actually doing it, which changes the theoretical framework around it. And it's that shift which, thinking about the environment, for instance, really brings to light the need to think pragmatically about this and to have that as the basis for your theory. Now, we've got questions rolling in, so I need to get to the chat. And we have a rather large one, but really exciting and to the point, really. So backtracking a bit in our conversation, we have a question from Paul about a definition of consciousness. But I think this is really important because I suspect that there are some interesting and astute comments behind both of your talks here. What do you mean by consciousness? Or do you have a conception of consciousness?
Me?
Yes.
After you.
Yeah. Yep. Am I conscious? It's a whole other bag of worms. If you get, for instance, in science, you get a group of different scientists together and ask them what consciousness is, you'll have a bun fight within about 10-15 minutes. What is it? I have no idea, and I've no idea how to define it other than things talk and some things don't. And it's very predictable. So what I found, for instance, and I am not completely mad, but stones don't talk, but things that inhabit stones do. Things that are alive will communicate. And if something is communicating to me, that's conscious. And if it can break through my imagination to get something through to me, that's consciousness. I don't think consciousness is the complex list of, can it do this? Is it aware of itself? Is it aware of creation? Is it? I don't know. I leave all that to the academics. To me, what consciousness is, if something can communicate, and it, as a young magician, you question, is this my own mind? And this is why we're saying it's very important. Just go ahead with it. Just go for it, because through time and practice, you do start being aware that there are things that are not you that are communicating to you, and then you open these communications. To me, that's the consciousness. How it perceives itself and how it is when it's not dressed in my imagination, I have absolutely no idea, which is why I was saying in the talk, what are these beings that we're talking to? We really don't know. We have no idea. We give different dressings and classifications. That's for us, and that's for our imagination to work with. But if something crosses the bridge into your imagination to get a message through to you, then you're talking to a consciousness. What that consciousness is attached to and how conscious it is, I don't know. Sorry, it's not very intelligent answer, but that's as good as it's going to get.
I've been reading Bruce Smith's Key of Green recently. It's just over there. I was almost going to jump over and try and find the quote, but he's talking about consciousness pretty early on, and mentions that the first use in English one of the first use in English seems to be a play. I forget who, but one of the characters is discussing an awareness of her own desire and an awareness of how others will perceive her desire. And there's, obviously, like that, what we mean now by the word consciousness, but an awareness of one's own, some sense of being aware of what one is doing, right, is where the word comes from in English, at least when we're talking about it. So not to start off with what Webster's dictionary defines, but I think that's a helpful thing to talk about. There's a sense of awareness of desire, while also understanding that desire itself is rooted in perception and emerges from the sensitive faculties of the soul moving towards or away from things in various ways.
But desire is rooted within your body. If you take, if we in magic separate out the spirit and the body, desire comes from the body. It comes from your endocrine system. It comes from your digestive system. It's a part of a survival mechanism within the body itself. And
I think there may be a difference between locating the experience or the phenomenology of it in the body or through the body, but to say that it emerges from the body as opposed to emerging from the nexus of the porous, like, self and environment. Like, I don't think that's a consistent or accurate take on how early modern magicians would have been doing this stuff. I mean, we're talking about pre-Descartes, right? So we're talking about before, as Bruce Smith says, European intellectuals decide that we can think without our bodies.
Right. And we're talking about today. We're talking about modern magic now. Desire is a survival mechanism. So that's not communication. Desire is itself. I need sex, I need food, I need a drink of water, I want to talk to God. All of those things are rooted within the physical body. And that's one thing I've noticed over decades of inner work and working with beings and communicating with beings, is desire is not something that tends to come through. Not when it's not your conscious that's talking. Unless it's a physical type of being which wants to feed, and then it does feed off of your emotion by triggering your wants and needs, and then it can feed off of that energy. But in terms of, going out in the forest and things like that, and talking to nature wherever, is I think what we're actually dancing around is the word desire rather than necessity. You do get a lot of beings that communicate out of necessity, but that's not the same as desire. So I think this is one of the things when we have magicians talking that are from different types of magic, is finding and bashing out a vocabulary where we're all thinking the same thing, because it's like you might be understanding desire different or quoting desire in a different way that I'm thinking of desire.
I suspect, yeah. But I think that's an interesting point around the kind of practical agnosticism you've raised as well. As like it's not necessarily even useful to try and fundamentally know like what we're talking to or what the nature of it is. And I agree that on a practical level, it's more important to actually engage with what's there rather than let anxiety about what this means get in the way of the actual experience you're having. I agree. I think it's also worth us bearing in mind that there are an awful lot of perspectives, like non-Western perspectives on what consciousness is, that are worth us, acknowledging as different stories, different sets of people feeling out different parts of the elephant.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think there's also a difference between like a pragmatic kind of agnosticism there and saying that it's unknowable, right?
Yeah.
I'm reminded of a playful interpretation of consciousness, which thinks with the fact that it can mean with. So consciousness is a kind of thinking with, which speaks to the idea of communication, and also desires kind of susceptibility to desire. Now we have a really long and beautiful question from Chris, who is an artist who works very closely with a particular place, a coastal dune system that contains a series of marshes. And they think traditional astrologers would say that the dunes, being dry, hot, and barren, belong to Mars, and perhaps attribute them to the zodiacal sign of Aries. The marshes, of course, are very different, being moist and cool, and could be said to belong to the zodiacal sign of Cancer. This opens up for me a whole array of traditional symbolism with which to engage as an artist. Really fascinating perspective. Would a geomancer be able to use this symbolism in order to contact and perhaps communicate with non-human spirit entities in this environment? So speaking to some of the things you didn't really have a chance to get into much in your talk, how might this look or work in practice? How different is this to the more shamanistic type approach, such as Josephine describes? Great question.
That's a wonderful question. Yeah.
Different languages, right? Different interfaces there.
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. That engagement with landscape being based on like those Aristotelian manifest qualities of the can you touch it? Is it hot? Is it cold? Is it wet? Is it dry? Those kinds of things. So they give us an elemental basis, and then developing from there. Yeah. Absolutely. I think the easiest way to frame how like a diviner or the geomancy I practice, like informed by like pre-modern practices and talking to dead geomancers. It's the sorcery from the sortilege, right? So most divination tools, I think, you could use for active sorcery or active courting of the spirits of those figures, right? In the same way that, or in a not dissimilar way to the way that we might, if a significant tarot card falls for us in a reading, we might take that card and use it as an image of that thing as well. And at what point do the lots of fate in sortilege have the option presented to those who can now understand them to rearrange them a little bit, right? The interaction between knowledge and action is very interesting to me there. And we get a lot of trial records of diviners being accused of trying to cause the things that they're reading on. And I don't think that's entirely an ignorance about how divination and sorcery aren't necessarily so separate. So for me personally, I work with the forms of the figures as these kind of haunted doorways where spirits of the patterns and coherences that we're describing can come through. And then for me, it becomes the use of geomantic sigils that are based out of the forms of the figures themselves. And there's a couple of reasons for that. There's some semiotics to it. The way that we talk about the things that are called through those figures being bound or being given form in some way. Geomantic figures, again, without pictures, it's kind of difficult to show. They're points in a binary system, so 1 or 2 dots. You can do them with these lovely gang sign things. So the figure of conjunctio 2 1 1 2, the devil horns on its side, is a mercurial figure of the crossroads, amongst other things. So it's lots of X's, or lots of things that look like X's, or things that look like, say, hourglasses or whatnot, that fundamental shape that you're connecting the dots. And so as such, they seem to exist somewhere between early modern ideas of sigils as very particular astrological symbols, and modern ideas of sigils, Austin Spare, of, and I mean this absolutely respectfully, DIY magic squiggles, right? That you are making your own meaning and your own thing, and you are constructing something or creating something, or there's an emergence going on. And so for me, it's about going to the spaces that already have those coherences of spirits, and calling them and cohering them by the things, by like calling to like, by game recognizing game, and then working with them through those, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Basically.
No, I know nothing about geomancy, so it's pointless asking me anything.
No, but the question was wanting to look at how different this would be to the approach that you described. So I think the idea is that an artist who wants to kind of listen, I suppose, to a landscape, and using these different approaches of listening. So Al's description of listening through figures, and your description of listening by learning first to recognize the patterns of these places, and then becoming.
I mean, she said she was an artist. To me, what I would do, if she's working with a very particular piece of land and she's working as an artist, she's already starting to communicate with the land by creating on the land. What I would do is that I'd go out into these dunes and hang out there and draw and paint and sleep and eat my sandwiches and leave some sandwiches for the creatures, and watch how the wind moves the sand, and watch how how water or rocks interact with it, what creatures come through. That's how I would build up a relationship with it. And then because I work as a ritual and visionary magician, so that's my form. That's how I pattern things. Al works with these different patterns and signs. That's how his mind flows through it as an artist. Those are the greatest magicians, because what she can do is actually give voice to the land by sitting on it, getting used to it, and then letting the art do itself. All that she does is provide the hands and the materials and let it speak, and then build up a communication that way. There's many artists that have done that over centuries, and particularly in the last 100 years, is a series of paintings of communication with the land. Monica Schuh, who was from Sweden, she's dead now. She was an amazing character, an amazing magician and an artist. And that's one of the things she did. I would say, well, what are you planning to paint? She said, I don't know till I get there. And when I get there, I'll know, because then I'll start painting it, and that's what it wants to say. What's it saying? I don't know, but that's what it wanted to say. And then 2 years later, she'll say, I know what it was saying. It was saying this, but it's a bit late now. But yeah, that's how you build up your relationships.
What's interesting here is that it's almost like a kind of complementary movements. I mean, I may be oversimplifying, but in geomancy, using geomancy as a technique of attentiveness to place, you could start with the figure, and then from the figure, you find that which resonates with it, and then sort of movement from the inside to the outside. And Josephine, when you described the method, which is more the artist one, you start from the outside and then you come in, right? These are sort of complementary movements, because what you have is this image, like the geomantic image. So you have these two symbols at the end, but they were reached in really different ways, but they're sort of complementary. And we're talking about techniques that can be used also complementary, like by one person. This is really fascinating. Does that make any sense? That sort of
yeah, absolutely. There's a big deal made of the fact that the figures and their sigils, these 16 like answer figures of the system, are said to be betwixt images and characters, which is to say that they are both ideographic and pictographic. So sometimes you can read, conjunctio as the X that marks the spot, literally the X on the contract that you can't read. There are a bunch of associated meanings there. But also it's conceived of as partly just, in the same way we talk about like barbarous names or words, like that's just the cheat code that makes the universe do a certain thing. And that we have both going on is semiotically fascinating, but also very practically useful in terms of, yes, the feeling of the thing and the engagement with an underlying layer. Well, not even an underlying layer, a ground of possibility that is like allowing things to, and is in the process of unfolding and emerging.
Kind of virtuality, yeah. So we now have a question to Josephine. Are there any parallels between the everyday magical awareness that you described and the expanding web of context that comes with an ecological awakening?
Well, an ecological awakening, with this meaning of an ecological awakening, are you talking about the planet changing or our awareness? I'm presuming what the question is meaning is our awareness. Yeah. Yeah. The thing is that one relies on the other constantly. If you have an everyday awareness, you also then start to see over time changes, damage, shifts in climate, how farming affects things like that. And we have this huge crisis going on in so many different ways around the planet. One helps you understand the other because you start to notice it. And again, it's back to building that relationship. And that's so important in ecology. If you have an absolutely emotive relationship with the land around you, you're going to protect it more. When it comes to, from an action perspective, there's lots of big things that are going on around the world through legislation, economics, through psychology, through environmental studies, things like that. And you also have to look after your own backyard. You also have to look after your own little area. And if you get to know your own little area and start to look after it, you are contributing. And the more people that do that, the more change that starts to bring, not only on an outer level, but magically at an inner level. It starts to snowball. It starts to change consciousness. And it starts to move outwards. It's like throwing a pebble in the water magically, and it starts to ripple out. This is why it's, I do get a lot of questions from people who are interested in magic or are studying magic. They'll say, this is such a disaster. What rituals can I do? And it's like, don't even start there. Start by looking after what's around you with intent, with magical intent, to bring whatever change is necessary rather than your own imposed. Let's keep the environment as it is now. That's not what you should be doing, is whatever is needed so that it's very fluid, so that it can shift and change. The planet is constantly changing. So you work with that capacity. And from an inner perspective, what starts to happen is new patterns form. And new patterns start to connect with someone else that's doing that, probably in a completely different way, but it starts to form another pattern. And from a magical perspective, those patterns start communicating and changing and shifting, which then starts to flow through into the consciousness of the magicians and the people. So, there's all the big stuff you can do, and there's also lots of little things that, from an outer perspective, an everyday perspective, help. They do good stuff, feed the birds, look after things. From a magical perspective, doing that on the outer starts to change things on the inner. If you do it with intent, with focused intent, and you pay attention, you start to, it doesn't take rituals, it takes everyday things. And then they all start to connect up. And so, people like Al that are doing his thing, if he does it with intent, and he's getting into a conversation through his forms of divination with the land where he is, that starts to form a pattern as well. And these patterns do start talking to each other, start interconnecting. You start to bring in a change. And then eventually you start to see it in the consciousness of the people. It starts to shift. A bit like social engineering, but using magic slowly.
I think if I'm thinking right on here, this is something that struck me in listening to your talk, Josephine, about imagination, and it struck me that that's the extra piece, right? We're not just talking about like an individual kind of connection. We're talking about how that affects everyone, and certainly this older idea of the imagination, not just as a image making faculty in our own, a glorious portal in our own skulls, but has like this field like quality. Right? This is the same concept that pre-modern doctors talk about. The difficulty of people catching other people's nightmares, and that we are capable of. That the consciousness is not localized within like the boundaries of this bone dome, right? And that part is interesting to me, right? How do we think ecologically, not just in terms of like our individual relationship to nature and the outside, but like to each other, and those ideas around humans being in some sense natural and emerging from nature. That Alan Watts thing about the planet peoples, like the apple tree apples. This is a verb that's going on. I'm interested in those notions where we are connected. We don't happen to the earth. We're part of it, coming out of it. And I find that with natural astrology, charting, not just places of natural beauty, but also places where humans have affected the environment, and that a battlefield is martial, but it's no less natural in terms of this natural magic than an ant heap is saturnine, right? It's a thing that animals do in the world. That doesn't mean that everything we do is fine. I want to be very careful about that, but I want to, that's interesting to me, conceiving how humans emerge from their environment and affect each other as well. The imagination is shared to an extent. That field.
Yeah, and also this thing with there's too much Disney realm that can get into both magic and ecology, and one of the things that nature is creative and destructive. It isn't Disney, it's tooth and claw, and it's constantly changing, and it's constantly creating, and it's constantly breaking down and destroying. And finding that center for magicians to let both sides flow through and understand that everything in nature is destructive as well as creative. And like you say, Al, you have to be careful with the language, because someone will go, "Oh, it's okay, then I can destroy as much as I like." Yeah, no, that's not the point. Is being the balance and learning to work with that balance.
Yeah, and one of the things that has come up a lot, especially in the Witch Bodies panel, is the way in which magic finds it necessary to kick back against this strong nature culture division, right? Because necessarily, if magic is attention, of course, if we don't accept that, then we have a problem. But if it is attentiveness, it's attentiveness to everything, really. And to make that distinction between what deserves our attention and what doesn't creates lots of problems. Because of course, if we can't show like the plastic spoon attentiveness, then we won't. And then that's why we have rubbish dumps, right? Instead of having a kind of a better way of reusing objects. So we're lots of new questions falling in. Now, there was one that was more of a comment, but spoke to something quite interesting, though, which is that stones do not talk, Beatrice says about an earlier comment that Josephine made about it's the being that inhabits the stone that communicates, not the stone itself, which I thought was really interesting. And I know if you'd like to say something more about how you have found, because you said that you found from experience that stones don't speak, but it's a sort of being that inhabits the stone. And I suppose how that would speak to what has floated about in some of our earlier conversations, which is animism.
I mean, it's just in terms of communicating. I personally, and this is one of the problems with magic, is it has to come from your own personal experience, and how somebody else will maybe have a completely different experience. What I found personally is when I get an actual direct communication, it often tends to be a being within the stone, not the stone itself. However, one of the things that I spent a lot of time doing in my late 30s was working in caves and with mountains and with fault lines, is sinking into stone in vision, is working and just taking myself down and then going down and down and down into the stone. And what I expected when I was doing that work was it to be like going into a very cold room, or a very dense space. And I spent a lot of my teenage years underground as a caver. So I know what it feels like to be in an enclosed space. It didn't feel like that. What it felt like was that I was in something that was aware that I was there, and I was aware of it, but there was never any communication. Now, I could then say, well, a stone has never communicated to me, but then you think of the age of stone, how old stone is, what its time cycle is. And then you think of the time cycle of a human, when like a nanosecond to stone. So it could be that stone is consciousness, that it has consciousness, but I'm moving too quickly to be aware of that.
Yeah, that's fascinating. The way in which non-humans will communicate, but we may not be able to actually perceive the communication.
Well, I found that with trees, and especially working in the Pacific Northwest in the US, with the very big trees, with the redwoods there, is their time, was so long compared to mine. And it's like, for instance, I was in this area near Santa Cruz many years ago, and I was in this small grove, and I was just sort of hanging out and eating a sandwich, and I got this communication of, get out, danger, get out, so we're all going to die, get out. And so I panicked and left. And an earthquake, that was the epicenter of an earthquake, but 2 weeks later. But that 2 weeks later was that second to that grove. And that was the first time I was in my, I don't know, early 30s, that it ever occurred to me that things in nature have different time lengths.
Different time scales, right? We're back to consciousness and octopuses or aliens or others, and that notion of how do we know that it's going to look like what we expect it to look like? How do we, and crucially, how do we afford a reasonably wide field to be surprised? How do we leave room to be amazed by how weird spirits might be? And for me, redwoods especially, like that glimpse of deep time, of like, you walk into that clearing and it's clear because a tree that big used to be there and now isn't. So it took that long to grow and then that long to, love redwoods. But for me, the point around, I might not be able to communicate with the mountain, and I've had similar experiences where I can get a sense that I am, I'm glimpsing something vast and cyclopean, not to get too Lovecraftian, but the communication works. So finding translators, finding intermediary spirits, building networks of interrelationality, these grapevines. Same with ancestor work, right? Like, I can't speak Old English as well as I would like to, but I have a couple ancestors in between me and them that are able to telephone game back and forth down the dinner table, so to speak. So building, and again, that's a way of like learning how like the other thinks, the space for that, and also building collaborations between intermediaries and thinking about these as translation issues.
Yes, I mean that's how the Egyptians worked, particularly is their deity that wasn't the god, and that wasn't the goddesses and things like that. That was an intermediary with the force of nature.
And in the same way, trees are going to require certain fungi to even be able to interact with their land as well, right? That those intermediaries are literally ensuring that nutrients can be passed back and forth.
Yeah.
There's a fascinating
look at how nature is itself. Sorry.
No. I was reminded of a really interesting text that the pianist and composer Olivier Messiaen wrote. It's called A Treatise on Ornithology, I think. And he thinks about the timescales of different beings, different creatures, different non-human creatures. He's especially fascinated by birds. And he translates the problem of scalability, he translates it into music. And so he takes the sort of the rhythm of birdsong and he slows it down so it's comprehensible to a human ear. And he uses music as a mode of translation. Just sort of music and magic can also have connections, don't they? So I'm now going to put together two questions. I hope that's all right, but I thought they were interrelated and we have so many coming in. First question talks about how we distinguish between daily magical awareness and religious awareness, which I thought spoke to something that, Al, you mentioned at the beginning of your talk, which is that when doing geomancy, you're supposed to be in a sort of prayerful mindset, right? Which seems to suggest that there is this fluidity between religious and magical awareness. And then the second one was asking about what were some of the elements and practices that mediate our communication with non-humans or mediate the invitation, things like listening, meditation, or psychedelics. So I thought there was just an interesting connection between those two questions. Is there this fluidity between religious and magical awareness? Maybe the distinction is not particularly helpful. And then what are some of the tech that we can use to facilitate that awareness and listening?
In terms of religion and magic, to me, they're very separate things. Religion is heavily tied up with culture, with different genetic lines, different tribes. It comes out of the land. A religion comes out of the people in the land, and it's made by man as a way of talking to what's around them, a way of talking to God. And it plays to what humans think are the desires of the gods. So I really like this, so I'm going to give it to you. There's all, and you're bigger than me, so I'm going to be really nice to you and butter you up. Whereas magic, for me anyway, and the stream that I work in is a lot more pragmatic and a lot more based around necessity. So I wouldn't pray before I did something, but I would still myself and become very quiet, so that I'm tuned and then ready to work. So but there is many streams of magic that do cross over into religion, and I work with various different religions for their patterns as a form of tapping into things and communicating with things, and as a way of understanding. But I think you have to be slightly careful, deciding is what you're doing religious or is what you're doing magical, because when you start to cross those over, it starts to get sticky from a magical perspective. It can cause all sorts of problems. So I think you have to think very carefully why you're doing something. I think anything in magic is why. What are you trying to do? What are you trying to achieve? And is this for you to make you feel better? Or is this actually for something outside of you? And if it's for you to make you feel better and get you tuned, then that's fine. But often when you're trying to connect with spirits, being prayed at is the last thing that they tend to want. They're just like, get what? What do you want? What do you need? Why? Or I'm trying to tell you, shut up. I'm trying to tell you something, So that's my take on that. I don't know what Al thinks.
I think it's really important that we bear in mind something that you raised in your talk, Josephine, about how even if we aren't, and maybe especially when we aren't, we as Westerners, for want of a better term, even when we aren't consciously identifying as Christian, we have been Christianized. Our culture has that overlayer on it, and we need to be very careful about examining that. I think that's especially true when we talk about what we mean by different religious and magical contexts. The outsider looking in view is that religions are man-made, but the emic view from priests of those religions is that those religions were revealed or were transmitted or were given by the gods to people. So there's a distinction here, and obviously, like, user error is always going to be a factor. But I think that's worth bearing in mind, especially when in my experience of being involved in Afro-diasporic religious and spiritual practices and sorcerous practices, is that the distinction is very much like what priests do versus what sorcerers or magicians do. Like it's there's a kind of a labeling theory thing. We're all working from the same cosmos, but one of them is through some gods, and one of them is doing something a little bit different. One of those, agreed, is worship, and knowing which you're doing, I agree, Josephine, is absolutely crucial. Yeah, but I think again the difference between what are you engaging with and how is that shifting your ability and awareness to do a thing doesn't necessarily mean that you are, if you're using religion or meditation or a spiritual practice to do magic, right? To as you say, like find your center again, if I'm not putting words in your mouth, that you can go to your gods and pray and like ask for the clarity, strength, wisdom, happiness, health, etc., and then go and do some magic. And it's linked in your life, but that doesn't mean that you are shoving that thing into that thing you're doing. It's a way of drawing strength from different sources.
Yeah. And I think as in terms of tech to facilitate communication, magic, Western magic alone has huge amounts of different tech, so to speak. Basically, once you're into communicating with beings, you're needing to use the imagination, because that's the filter. It's like, if you're going to look at art, you need eyeballs. It's pretty simple. So the imagination is the translator, and dresses things so that you can recognize and also form a bond with something. So imagination, you need to use the mind. To use the mind, first you need to be able to shut out and sit down and be quiet. And then when you can sit down and be quiet, then sit down and listen. And then learn to be still and move around while holding that stillness and listening without it being an effort. Hence, so much in Western magic throughout history started with very basics of meditation and learning stillness. And the idea of using the mind as a major tech in magic, even within ritual, you should be using your mind. Goes right back to the Greek philosophers. It's, you look at Plotinus, you look at all of these, they're full of very subtle hints of, yes, but you need to use your mind. The mind is the most important. And when we're reading those texts, we think, oh, I have to be intelligent. That's not what it's saying. Is your mind, your vision, your dreams, your imagination, forming that is your tech. And each different type of magic has different ways of approaching that, of training it. But it's not something that you can just sort of print off the internet and boom, you've got it. Like everything that's real, you have to work at it and develop it. And the other one, actually, which is a very good form of communicating with beings if you're really not going to be able to work through the imagination, and it's something that I'll talk about, is divination. And going back to what I was talking about a while ago, when I'm out in nature and I pick up something in a pattern, one of the things that I do is work with a deck. If I'm picking up something serious, I need to know exactly what it is, why it is, where it's going, who it is. And I use a deck and I use my own layouts to do that. And I design my own decks for specific things so that I get a good vocabulary, because with my own decks, I just use words. That's my vocabulary that I can build from to get specific communication. So it's no good for doing a reading to find out if my Auntie Betty's going to be pregnant for the 8th time, but it will tell me if there's something damaging coming that I can intervene in some way. So what is that intervention? You use a different layout, get that down. And you can use that same method for talking with beings. It's a vocabulary, basically. It's just a translator. And so, with divination is the other very strong leg in magic. Imagination and divination are the two forms of communication to go forward to build relationships with beings and to get communication going properly.
On that theme of language, we have a question that touches on something we mentioned earlier, which is, to what extent is this nature culture, the human nature dichotomy, all these dichotomies that we've been talking about, maybe also the magic religion one, is it a result of the limited vocabulary of Western languages? Meanwhile, many ancient and indigenous languages, being frequently more verb than noun-based, ascribe a more equal and reverent regard toward more than human living worlds, and thus allow for a more open two-way mode of communication. I wonder, what is the importance of the language and vocabulary that you use and work with in your practice? And yeah, it'd be interesting to hear about whether you've learned thinking with other languages, and yeah.
It is important. And I never realised how important language is to how it forms how you think, how you output. Until I got into conversations with magicians around the world from completely different cultures and using different language, and realising that even though you can translate certain things, it doesn't have the same meaning at a very deep level. It can get, concepts can be almost impossible to switch between certain cultures because the vocabulary isn't there. And the verb, the form of language that uses more verbs than nouns is a really useful language. I spent a lot of time looking at the funerary text from particularly from the New Kingdom, the early New Kingdom and the Middle Kingdom. And Middle Egyptian is very pragmatic. It's very interesting. It's very layered. It has all these different layers to it. And it's very doing. It's all very doing words. And the titles of spirits are what they do. They're not given abstract names, which started to come in by the time you're getting into, Ptolemaic and then you're lapping into early Christianity and everything. Everything had abstract names. They had names that didn't really mean much. Practicality, that is the way to go. If you want to talk to beings, these practicalities. And English in particular is not very practical. Not really. Just in the conversations we're having, it's far more abstract, and it's, the question that was asked was saying in a tribal society, the language structure is different. It's very verbs, and for a while I lived on a reservation and worked for a tribe. And one of the things I found there, even though everyone was talking English and Salish, is that when they were talking English, is they're still thinking in Salish terms, which I found fascinating. And it took me a while to sort of switch gears for communications. But it's so much fucking easier. Sorry. It's so much easier when you've got a practical vocabulary going with people, and it isn't all this abstract. It isn't all this academic talk. It's just really down to action, doing, function, necessity, which then changes how you think, which changes how your magic works. The whole thing becomes less cumbersome and a lot more fluid and a lot more pragmatic, and then it starts to work things out. I don't know how Al thinks.
I'm coming around to the opinion that I think most magicians should try and learn another language, even if it isn't, even if you're not interested in, I don't know, 19th century French diabolists. Like, learn French. Like don't do it to raid someone else's temples, but do it to affect yourself and to understand that and get used to not knowing how to communicate again. That's really I'm in the process of learning several languages for the traditions I'm part of, and I'm not good at it. But I'm trying to turn up and bang my head against it. And there's a sense of getting better at things I'm not good at. That's why I'm turning up to try and do this work. But also just getting used to not expecting everything to be on your terms. And especially, let's be clear, in the Anglosphere, and the way that an awful lot of our friends in various post-colonial departments and things throughout the academy and certainly outside of it are very interested in how a dominance of the English language is not helpful in terms of not just these different ways of being, but these complex articulations of things that we risk losing when languages aren't shared and passed on and whispered into the ears of children and things. So I think it's really crucial. I think magic is about engaging with the other and working out that we're weirder than we thought we were, and that the world is weirder than we thought it was. And I think language and specifically for me, I've been trying to appreciate. I remember this feeling and use it in my acting. The feeling of like not being able to communicate clearly in a language with a room full of elders, and like what that is and how that like moves me to try and improve and do better. I think there's a hell of a lot of egotism that comes with, you've got to have an ego about you to think that you can talk to like angels or things to a certain extent. And as such, we need to be very careful about how we don't feed our I need to be very careful about how I don't feed my pomposity. And so putting myself in position, learning how to be used to knowing what to do when you don't know what to do. And so for me, that's that vital wit. Divination is a part of that. Developing spirit contact is a part of that. Developing consistent relationships and being what you turn up to do. Over and over again.
And language-wise, if you're having to learn a load of languages, is if you're in the community with one of those languages, get away to some pub in one of the places that doesn't speak English, one of the backstreet cafes.
Right, immersion, yeah.
You'll learn really fast in the worst possible way. But it's exactly what you said, is feeling what it feels like to not know what the hell anyone is talking about, and having to learn quickly. Good magic.
And also speaks to what you've both been talking about, which is, especially Josephine, this kind of resistance that we have or resistance to simply listening, right? Because this is the challenge. You go into a room where you don't quite know the language, a bit. You can one has a natural arrogance to assume communicability or the sort of superiority of one's own language, and faced with something you don't understand, you don't really want to listen. It's that kind of tension, which is the same thing that's going on when you walk into a forest. Like there is some kind of message coming across to you, and you assume a sort of a superiority of your modes of communication. That's really interesting. Those parallels between those situations. We have down a few questions, and I think I'll just do these next two together again, as I did with the previous ones. I hope that's all right. The first one is about speaking of ways of engaging with feelings of fear and with the entities and dynamics which we may feel to be frightening, ugly, uncanny, threatening, monstrous, or simply beyond our understanding. Again, speaking to this idea of why it is that we don't engage as readily as we should with the world around us. Is this related to our deep vulnerability and our fear of those aspects of existence which we are afraid of, experience as destructive and dangerous, or just as unknown, unpredictable, uncontrollable? Thoughts on that. Ideally, ways that allow us to maintain our own integrity and safety to some degree while acknowledging and integrating those shadowed aspects of our experience. So I suppose, like, what's the risk here, and how much do we put ourselves on the line? And then the next question is about relating magic to technologically created space. I thought these went together because there's an aspect of fear in this, also in vulnerability online and in a media which in many ways depersonalizes the voice. Can existing magical practice be used in technological spaces? And is this relevant in this space? Or will it need to evolve? Perhaps in relation to artificial intelligence and so on. Does it mean that artificial intelligence are going to bring mythology and religion into any space we can explore or create? So questions of fear and to what extent do we have to put ourselves on the line? and is there a way of keeping us safe? And then also in relation to technology and what that does. Can it help? Is it simply bad?
In terms of technology, I'm probably the worst person to ask because I'm, still in the 20th century. I haven't quite dragged myself into the 21st century. I still don't know how to use a smartphone properly. So, and my internet use is limited in that I just do certain things on the internet and then that's it. So there's a whole world out there that I just do not understand how it operates. So, I am probably the worst. I wouldn't touch it magically with a barge pole, put it that way. After what I've seen with social media and all this type of thing, it's like putting your fingers in the toilet. Would not go there, but that's because I'm old-fashioned and cranky. So, not my thing. You probably get a lot more common sense out of Al than me.
I don't know about that. What this makes me think of is I don't want to not address the issues around vulnerability in terms of like opening up and how how we feel about the unknown. But I want to emphasize that I don't think this disconnect is just like a personal atomized anomic issue, or if it is, it's because there are way more factors. Like magical disconnect in the world is a political issue with personal solutions, I think, and interpersonal solutions. Like to say we're disconnected because the vastness of the cosmos or the weirdness of the cosmos scares us is true, but it's not the only factor here. Like the disenchantment of the world, like, you don't have a better relationship with the forest because many of us weren't taught, like in any sense, how to have a relationship with that forest and had to like cobble it together ourselves. So I don't know if I'm completely missing the point of that question there, but I think that's worth bearing in mind, like the process of how magic is phased out over the course of the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, like are things that we're still, it's too soon to say, right? We're working out the influences of those, but it to locate it as solely a individual problem, I think fractures it and doesn't allow for us to look at how we can work together to deepen those relationships.
I think in terms of fear and fear of being damaged or big scary monster eats my head. In terms of talking to things, most people when they first start doing things magically in magic, don't get very far. It's like a toddler. It's like you've put the safety gate on and they can run around and bang themselves and this, but actually they're okay. They're not going to get out onto the main road. Sometimes you get people who are natural magicians, and they can connect with things in their consciousness, and they do see, and they're not nuts, and they do see and communicate with a lot of things, and it terrifies the shit out of them sometimes, and I can totally understand that. In which case, what you have to do is back it up, basically. Is you want to start communicating with things, you want to start making connections with things, and you're fearful of it. It's baby steps. You don't need to be connecting with everything and having communications and conversations with everything around you until you're comfortable with it in your own time, and then you start to connect. And that's what I'm doing with the internet. Basically, it scares the shit out of me. A, because I don't know what I'm doing, and B, energetically. Everything there, everything that's in human consciousness is in that pattern, an electric pattern of communication. So from a magical perspective, it's like sticking your head in a sewer. And I've not found a way to do it in a healthy way. So I tend to not stick my head in that sewer, so to speak. But there are magicians that I do know who do very interesting things with the internet. And not silly, I'm doing all these sigils and I'm going to crash everything, but are actually working with the consciousness of the internet, of networks, of computers. That fascinates me. And I'm still in baby phases with a lot of things like that because I tend to blow up computers, so I'm not a good case for that. But there are younger magicians who are stretching their consciousness out into technology. AI, that would be a very interesting thing, is to expand the consciousness, human consciousness, into the pattern of AI and see if there is a pattern there that connects. I don't know. And it does terrify me too. Basic rule of thumb, though, if it terrifies you, don't do it.
I think we have time for one or two questions. We'll see how we get along. We've got one from Gwendolyn who asks, when we start engaging in such a way to create new patterns, we're transforming ourselves, as Josephine says, and we're also changing the things around us. An example of this might be helping an injured animal recover. The communication goes on, which can change things. Where is this change leading us? Again, with geomancy, to be given guidance on changes we can effect. Are these activities aimed at living in line with truth, which might then align our lives to fate?
Well, in any conversation, where is it taking you? And this is one of the things that I think we have to be very careful of in magic, is dragging the 19th century mindset with us. I'm starting a conversation. Where is it taking me? Where is it taking magic? Where is it taking us as a species? Who knows? This conversation we're having tonight, where is this taking us? We have no idea unless you sit down and do divination and find out what's coming out of it. I think that you can end up trying to control without actually realizing that you're trying to control something, and that you're trying to control all communication, all expression, all magic, which you can't do. So I think what I would say to that is sit back and think about, why did you ask that question? Where did that question come from in terms of magical practice? It's, again, learning to be pragmatic and go with the flow, rather than having to have a set series of goals and jumps that you're going to jump over. Let these conversations and these interacting patterns go where they need to go, which again is very tribal necessity. Where does the river go? Where it needs. It doesn't book an appointment.
Thank you.
I think, again, it's worth us thinking about when we're talking about creating new patterns, and it sounds like what we're actually saying is creating new engagements with patterns. And I want to be clear about that distinction, because I don't think I'm going out when I visit a river and I do work with the figure of via the moon's like dynamism and changeability. I'm not creating that pattern. The first time I do it, I'm creating an engagement. I'm hoping that an emergent friendship emerges, but that pattern's already there. And so for me, there's a sense of infinity and a grain of sand about this, where it's going, and I think that's an alignment with a natural truth, at least, or a set of natural truths, hopefully, is that that's a way of engaging with that mystery of water, of rivers, of rejuvenation, of change, of various ways that the moon helps understand rivers, and rivers help us understand the moon and its energies and spirits. And so, again, like if you're looking for the things that are already there and like helping awaken and upregulate and downregulate certain parts, then the alignment is in the course of exploring, understanding the patterns of nature. Like, so yeah, I think yes, like in brief.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you. I think we have time for one last question. This is an interesting one. Have you experienced having to work on land that had no traceable connection? I'm thinking of the all forgotten, people who were in communication with the environment being all gone. In short, no visible traditions to go back to. If you have such experience, the intermediaries that you were talking about just now, do they still manage to reach out? I suppose this is relating to what Ali was saying. But I'm trying to get at, was there a time when there was a dead end, no ways to communicate? So this is particularly thinking, I assume, with the spirits of past humans. rather than trying to communicate directly with the land.
I didn't get the first part of that question because your microphone faded out.
Oh, I'm sorry. This is a question about experiencing having to work on land that had no traceable connection with people.
I'm not quite sure what they're meaning by that, because again, you faded out again. A patch of land that has no people or no past of people?
Yeah, I think that the question is about, I think it was picking up on something that I was talking about with intermediaries between myself and an ancestor who lived when...
Right, yeah. For me, one of the places when I lived in the States, I lived in West Montana, out in the wilderness, and the tribe had only been there for about 100 years, and not a big tribe. And before that, the different tribes used to come in, because there's three, it was a confederacy. Various tribes used to come into that valley, do certain things, and then leave. They never lived there. In just before they were marched onto the reservation, they did do some burials there, but most burials there are pretty new as well. There is nothing old, dead, person-wise on that land, which I found really interesting working with Magically. It was completely different because I was used to being in places where there were dead people and generations of dead people. So being on a patch of land where there was no dead people was really, really interesting, and it was completely feral. So there was beings there, and my imagination could construct intermediaries, but they couldn't, which was an interesting situation. So there was communication. It was just like somebody shouting at me in Korean, and I don't understand Korean, so they shout louder, just to make sure that I get it, even though I still don't understand Korean. There was a lot of that, and how the communication got going eventually was by action. I think they're saying this, so I go do that. Is that what they meant? No, I get a kickback. Okay, let's try that one again. But there's no way, if you're talking about trying to reach very distant ancestors where there's no intermediaries, the way I would do that, which that sort of thing I've done, is using visionary technique over a period of time and going through a period of steps and stretching. For me, energetically, I found that exhausting, and it made me sick, but I did manage to get there. That is that, and with divination, I found that I couldn't do that with very distant ancestors without an intermediary, because there wasn't enough vocabulary. But I mean, again, if you're going to do that, you need the visionary techniques to be able to do it, or the natural ability that you've then exercised, so that you can hold, an hour and a half session of communicating with something using your mind. That's how I would do it. Or just get really drunk, and the communication might not happen, but it sounds really good at the time. You never know. There are people that do that.
I think if I'm understanding this right, I've experienced, I wouldn't say dead ends in terms of not seeing. I mean, yes, not seeing options, but the reframing from, if I go and like hold a particular attention or say particular words, it's a cheat code that the universe now has to do something back. Moving away from that model and towards a model of like, this is a conversation. I've been in plenty of places where, it didn't want to talk to me. It didn't want to talk to anyone, and that's not about an inability. That's go away. I don't want you here. This mountain is sacred. One of the ways it's sacred is we don't walk on it. Like, that kind of stuff. So dead end wise, if that's what we're talking about, yes, that we should hold out the possibility that, you know, just because you've talked to the plant, I'm trying to build a relationship with it. Well, that's great. Maybe the plant, you know, has other priorities right now. You know, it's just not that into you, right? That's also a thing we need to hold out, that if there's agency on both sides, there's agency on both sides, and therefore, you know, that sometimes not everyone wants to talk to you, nor indeed, you know, and it's a pretty entitled approach to expect everything to respond to you because you're talking to it, or because, you know, you've done the right things, whatever those might be. In terms of working on land where the people that worked it aren't there anymore, I mean, that's far wider issues around, like, you know, I mean, attempting to build relationships with, you know, not all intermediaries are human as well, and many traditions have ideas around intermediaries that might be totally human, that might be, you know, John Skull, the first person buried in a graveyard, right, who then becomes the doorman, so to speak, as distinct from like the lord and lady of the cemetery, to, you know, traditions where, like, because, you know, lightning struck that tree at that time, and, you know, a fox was going past at the time, and someone was stabbed to death there, like, all of those things cohere into the sense of a haunting that's the spirit of that place, that's emergent from it, and the things that are going on, but aren't themselves just strictly like a person or not a person. So again, like, how humans and the intermediaries relate isn't just about dead people or, you know, inhuman nature spirit. Like, there's interaction in, even as far as you say, Josephine, like the difference between, are there, you know, do you have family in the ground, right? Are they doing that kind of interaction with the earth and its spirits?
Yeah. And what you said is really, really important about the arrogance. You know, not everything does want to talk to you, and many things will tell you to go away in nice, polite language, or not. But yeah, that is a real big problem in Western magic, is arrogance and expectations of the, I will do this recipe and this will happen. And you bring that to communication with something that's outside of you, then you're going to start getting problems, building problems for yourself. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, both of you, for this conversation. I'm afraid we'll have to cut it short there. We could go on forever. We have so many questions in the chat. The chat will be saved, and I'll send this to both of you, able to see and want to interact further with the questions. And sorry we can't answer them, but yeah, there's too lively an audience. Yeah, so finally, I just want to thank you both, and thank you all the audience for your wonderful questions. And don't forget to sign up for our next seminar, which will be on the 26th of March with Dr. Sophie Dunn-Rockcliffe and Professor Esther Adenov. They'll be talking to us about ancient magic and the non-human world, chaired by Professor Thomas Harrison. And the papers will go live on the 19th of March on the Crash YouTube channel, all being well. Thank you for tuning in, and I really look forward to seeing you again soon. And thank you again, Al and Josephine.
And thank you.
Thanks for having me.